Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at day 3 of the rapid portion in the Tata Steel Chess India Rapid and Blitz event. Now, Magnus Carlsen, the 5-time world champion, has been on a massive heater. He has won 4 games in a row, and today, on the final day, he's leading by a half point going into it, but he really wants to continue to dominate. So Magnus is starting out with the white pieces in round number 7 against Vincent Keimer from Germany, one of the talented prodigies who we do think might challenge for the world championship in the future. All right, so let's jump right into the action. Now, Magnus has the white pieces, and the game starts out with the move d4. Here we get the move knight f6 from Vincent, and now we have c4. We get e6, knight to f3, d5, and now we have knight c3. Now, all this pretty standard so far. Vincent plays c6 here, and now we've transposed back into the semi-Slav defense. This can come out of many different orders. For example, you can also get it out of the standard d5, c4, c6, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, e6 order. But this order with e6 perhaps provides a little bit more flexibility. So we get c6. Magnus plays bishop g5, and now we get the move knight b to d7. Now, it's a little bit disappointing from the standpoint that the game could become really sharp, where Vincent to play pawn takes pawn after e4, b5, e5, h6, bishop h4, g5, takes, knight d7, takes, and queen b6. This is what is known as the classic Botvinnik system. It's very sharp. Anything can happen here, and there's a lot of play. Additionally, there's also the Moscow variation with h6, bishop h4, takes e4, g5, bishop g3, and b5. Also very sharp. All right, so we get knight b d7 instead. Here we have e3, and now Vincent plays move queen to a5, and this is now turned into the Cambridge Springs defense variation within the semi-Slav. Magnus takes on d5, we get knight takes pawn, and now we have the move rook c1, guarding the knight on c3. Here, Vincent takes the knight on c3, and now Magnus captures back with the pawn. Were Magnus to play rook takes knight after bishop to b4, it's a very quick and disastrous start here, as you will lose this rook on the diagonal due to the pin. You can't move the rook without losing your king. So Magnus takes with the pawn, rook still guarding the pawn, and here we get the move bishop to a3. Now, you might be wondering, why can't black play the move queen takes pawn? Now, black could try to capture this free pawn, but it is simply one pawn, and in this position, after bishop to d3, you will notice that black is way behind in development. You have 2 rooks, 2 bishops, and a king all on their starting squares. White can try to build a big white center as well, and in general, as you can tell from the valuation bar, this is a very difficult position to play. So we get the move bishop to a3. Now Magnus plays this move rook to c2 here, and after rook to c2 in this position, what's going on here is quite simply that we get the move c5, and we have bishop d3. Now, for Vincent, he wants to go b6, develop the bishop at b7 or a6 if he can, but he still has to be a little bit careful. Vincent takes on d4, Magnus captures with the e-pawn here, and now we get the move b6 being played. Magnus would love to capture back with the c-pawn, keeping his connect 5 intact, but you can't take with the c-pawn, as the king on e1 would simply be hanging. Also, knight takes pawn would hang the bishop on g5, and you resign the game immediately. So we got e takes d4. Vincent plays b6 here, trying to Fion Cheeto the bishop to b7, or potentially playing a move like bishop a6 to trade off this nice bishop on d3. Magnus goes for the move bishop to e4. We get rook b8. Now we have bishop f4. And after bishop to b7, black is actually completely fine. Now, what I think happened here is, as you can tell, Vincent Keimer came into this game loaded up to the gills with preparation. He has used no time whatsoever. He's moving very fast. And Magnus is actually down a lot of time. Computer thinks that after rook b8 castles, bishop b7, just to showcase the line, white can trade the bishops and sack a pawn with this move pawn to d5, and suddenly white is a little bit better in the resulting middle game. If black were to take with the e-pawn, there's rook to e1, king f8, and after rook to e2, suddenly you double stack, and white is doing very well. If black takes with the queen on d5, now you can play rook to d2 with a double stack on the d file, and after a move like queen to a5 and rook e1, black is really struggling here, as if you castle the king, you lose the horse, you move the horse, you get checkmated on d8, and again, the computer says this is very bad. But Magnus is way down on time in the situation. He's probably thinking he's got to move a little bit quicker, pick up the pace, so he plays the move bishop f4. We get bishop b7, sacking the rook, and now Magnus plays queen e2. Were Magnus to take the rook here on b8, after bishop takes bishop, suddenly the bishop on b8 is under attack, the rook on c2 is under attack, and white is in a lot of trouble. Just a sample line is bishop g3, takes, castles, and now after rook to c8, black is putting tons of pressure on the c file, can't bring the rook to cover the pawn, and white will probably lose the game. So Magnus plays queen e2. We got bishop to a6 being played. This also is a good move, but this is the first moment in the game where you can tell that Vincent Keimer is finally out of his preparation, and Magnus Carlsen can try to showcase his awesome skills when it's just a simple position. Now, what I think here is that probably Vincent had looked at the moves knight to d2 or bishop takes b7, which are the top two computer lines, but queen e2 is the third move, and now the game goes on. So here we get bishop to a6. Magnus plays bishop d3. We got the trade of the bishops, and now we have the move rook c8. Magnus castles, Vincent castles, and now we get the move c4. Here Vincent plays the move bishop to e7, retreating the bishop, first of all, simply because this bishop can be under some pressure on this a3 square, but secondarily, if you play a move like a6, there's this idea with knight g5 where suddenly white tries to go for a checkmate towards h7 right away. So bishop e7, bishop no longer under attack, and you stop knight g5 in this position. Magnus goes to h4 here, and now we get the move rook f d8, and Magnus plays rook b1. Now in this middle game position, it's very, very tense, very dynamic. Magnus wants to try to push one of these pawns forward, d5 or c5, but black's rooks here on c8 and d8 are perfectly placed to try and prevent the pawn pushes. So here we get queen h5. Magnus plays rook b5, queen g6, and now we get the move queen e2. Now what's interesting about this position is that the computer actually wants Magnus to trade the queens, and after a4 it gives white a very tiny advantage in this endgame. Now the reason that I say it's interesting is because Magnus is known as the greatest endgame player in the world. He has tremendous technique, maybe greatest endgame player of all time, frankly, but his technique is so great, and it's interesting that here he decides to eschew the endgame and keep the queens on the board with queen e2. Now we get to move h6. Magnus plays a4 here. We get queen to g4, and now we have the move g3 guarding the bishop on f4. Now in this position, Vincent decides to play the move a6. We get rook b2, and now he plays bishop takes pawn on h4. Now this is a very, very enterprising move here. White cannot capture back with the pawn as you lose your king on g1, and if you play knight takes h4 after takes and g5 here, black forks the bishop and the knight, and these pawns in the center on c4 and d4 still remain tremendously weak. That being said, the computer does think after d5 white has a very tiny advantage. So after bishop takes h4, Magnus ignores it all. He goes to a5, we get takes, and now he plays move c5, trying to push p here, create this pass pawn, push it up the board, and win the game. Vincent plays bishop to g5, and now we get this move c6 here, and Vincent takes the bishop on f4. Magnus takes on d7, we get the trade of the rooks, and now Vincent correctly sacrifices the bishop on g3 for the pawn. Now if black doesn't sacrifice, you can still play a move like e5, attacking the pawn on d7, and black is fine, but it's very slippery because if you play a move like bishop d6, now after rook to c8 here, bishop to e7, and a move like king g2 followed by queen e5 and queen c7 or queen b8, black is actually close to lost. So Vincent sacks the bishop by taking the pawn. We get takes, king f1, and now we have the move rook takes pawn. Magnus checks, we get king h7, queen e4, queen g6, and now after the trade we're in a pure endgame here where Vincent Keimer has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and Magnus has 1 juicer. So Vincent has 5 pawns here for a horse, and 5 pawns should be too much. As the famous saying goes, a horse can't stop a 5-pawn avalanche, or so you would think. Now that being said, however, when you look at the pawns, black has 2 sets of double stacked pawns here. You have pawns on g7 and g6, and a5 and a6 here, and because the pawns are stacked, they can't easily march up the board. That being said, black still should be in no danger of losing, but as we know, it is the one and only, the legend Magnus Carlsen playing with the white pieces. So we get king to e2, Vincent plays g5, and now we get king e3. One other important point to make is that if black is ever able to eliminate this last one, even if somehow you were to lose all 6 of these pawns, rook and knight versus a rook would be a theoretical draw, as we saw in the recent Fischerano event in St. Louis, where I played on for maybe 50-60 moves against Gregorio Parn, but I was unable to win. So after g5, we get king to e3, guarding the pawn now. So if black were to play g4, you move the knight and the pawn is defended. Vincent plays rook d6, we get knight to e5, and now we have the move a4. Magnus plays king to e4, and now we get this move a5, and here Magnus plays rook to c4. Vincent plays rook to a6, we get takes, and now we have this move king g8 being played, which is a pretty severe mistake here in this position. Mind you, it's very hard to play because frankly you really want to push the pawns on the king side, but it's very dangerous because if you play, let's just go back here, you play a move like h5 here, there's knight to f7 hitting the pawn and the rook, and after rook to d5 there's rook h8, king g6 check, and after rook takes h5 suddenly white is probably going to win the game because now your only pawn which isn't doubled is the pawn on e6. Pawns on the A and G file, they're on top of each other, they're stacked. So in reality, in this position, white probably will win this game. So we get back to this position after rook takes a4, and here Vincent plays king g8. h5 is possibly a move here, and black should be okay, but after knight to d3, g4, knight c5, rook b6, and rook takes a5, you might be feeling like you're actually in some danger because the pawns aren't super fast. The white king can get back very, very quickly to stop the pawns, and you're not really sure what's going on. Now, what you'll also notice here is that Vincent is way down on the clock here. He's way down on the clock. Now, I think, again, I've said this in many videos in recent times about blitz and rapid specifically, whose position is easier to play here? Ultimately, white's position is much easier to play because black has to figure out, when do you push the pawns? Do you just try and sit with king g8 like in the game? What are you doing? It's not easy, whereas Magnus has very simple ideas. Knight d7, knight c5, knight d3, knight c5, maybe knight c4 and take the pawn at a5. But Magnus's move will be a reaction to whatever Vincent does. So we get king to g8. Magnus plays knight to d3. We get king f7. And now we have the move knight c5, attacking the rook and the pawn. Magnus goes rook a8, we get king to e5, and now we have the move g4. Now at this point you'll notice it already. Vincent has completely messed it up. He is losing in this position because he's going to lose the pawn on e6, and now white is starting to push p with the d pawn. So we get g4, knight takes pawn, h5 is played, and now we have d5 here. Magnus starts pushing the d pawn, knight is guarded, and black's pawns are really not all that fast. We get g3. Magnus plays rook a1, and now we get to move h4, and here we have the move d6 being played. Now Magnus understands that the pawns are not actually able to get up the board in a hurry. The knight is covering the queen square here, and if black goes h3, there is always knight g5 at the very least to win the pawn on h3. So we get g2. Magnus plays knight to g5 check, another excellent move here with limited time on the clock. If you were to play d7 here after h3, knight g5 check, now black can run over and grab the last white pawn on d7, and the game will be a draw. So we get the move knight g5. King f8 played by Vincent, and now we get to move rook to g1. This move, not the best move according to the computer, but honestly it's completely understandable because this pawn is super far advanced. Black can't support it with h3, and if you win the pawn you should win the game. Here Vincent plays h3, which is the last move, or last opportunity I should say, where Vincent could maybe save the game. If he were to play the move rook to e8 check, king d5, and rook e2, black probably is still losing technically, but I think there's a good chance he would save it. Instead he plays h3. We get knight takes h3. Vincent plays a4, we get takes, a3, and now Magnus plays rook f2. Now what on earth has happened here? You'll notice that Vincent has lost all his pawns. He lost the a pawn, he lost the g pawn, he lost the h pawn, and now he has one lone pawn on the board for the horse on h3 when he started it with 5 pawns. So he's lost 4 of his pawns here in this position, and it's really a tragedy to see from Vincent's standpoint, but it does just show how much of a wizard Magnus is. We get king to e8. Now we have king to e6. Vincent plays rook a6. If you go a2, there's check, check, you gobble the rook, you stop black from queening, you queen yourself, and you win in a few moves. So we get rook a6, and now Magnus plays this beautiful move, knight to g5 here, and Vincent ends up resigning the game. Now the reason Vincent resigns is if he ever moves the king, there's rook f8, checkmating the king on d8, no squares available. And if you play the move a2, which is the obvious move, white can sack the rook with rook takes pawn, and after takes, check king d8, you play knight f7, check the king, push the pawn, promote to a queen, and now you check and win the rook on a2, and you checkmate in a few moves. So after knight to g5, Magnus gets a huge win, his 5th win in a row. This game is maybe one of the few games in the last couple where he has been a little bit lucky. He was worse out of the opening. Definitely that end game, Vincent had some chances, but at the end of the day, Magnus does survive. He gets an epic win, and he pushes the lead even further. So Magnus is on a 5-game winning streak, and now we move to the 8th round where he is once again playing with the white piece against Danil Dubov, a strong Russian grandmaster. So Magnus on a 5-game streak. If he wins this game in the 8th round, he will all but ensure that he wins the rapid portion of the Tata Steel tournament. So we get e4. Daniil plays c5, we get knight f3, d6, and Magnus plays bishop b5 check. Now, Dubov obviously hoping that Magnus would go into the mainline complications. Most likely, we would have gotten a classical variation or a rouser, because that is one of Dubov's specialties. But instead, Magnus wants to play quiet chess with bishop b5 check. We get bishop d7, takes, and now we have the move c4 being played. Now, this is what is known as the canal attack within the Sicilian. This is a line that has existed for many years. Actually, one of my earliest memories in this system was the famous game played between Garry Kasparov and the world. I believe that was in 1999, maybe 2000, played over the internet, where this line was seen. So very, very old line. Magnus loves these setups because after knight c6, d4 takes, you get the classic Maroczy bind structure with the pawns on e4 and c4. Dubov goes g6, we get knight c3, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, and now the move h3 is played to stop black from playing knight to g4. Here we get castles, rook to c8, and now Magnus plays move b3, protecting the pawn on c4 from being under attack. Dubov plays b6, and now Magnus goes rook c1, we get rook e8, and here we have the move rook e1 being played. Now both players just shuffling their rooks to the squares they think are optimal, and here we get the move queen b7. Magnus trades the knights, and now he goes bishop to d4. And at this point already here, I'm going to be honest, I think that Magnus has great chance to win the game because he's got this fantastic pawn structure on the center of the board. Very limited play for black. One of the things that's great for Magnus here is that really for Dubov, the only counterplay he can get is to try and go a6 and b5 or something like e6 and d5. But either way here, white has great control over both the b5 and the d5 squares in this position, and it's very hard to play. And in rapid, it's even better because once again, your moves are going to be a reaction to whatever black tries to do. So we get the move knight d7. Magnus trades the bishops, goes knight to d5 here, creating the great connect 4 and some threats of forking as well. Dubov goes knight f6, we get queen to d2, and now we have the move knight takes knight being played. Now from Dubov's standpoint here, he's trying to bail out. He's probably feeling very uncomfortable with this position. Magnus has a great connect 4 in the center of the board. Knight is hitting the pawn on e7. You also have problems potentially on the diagonal if you were to play something like e6. After takes, there's even something like queen h6 maybe. There's also queen c3 and rook d1, and black is generally just suffering. So Dubov decides to trade the knights. We get e takes d5, an important point here that Magnus wants to use the open e file here and put massive pressure on this pawn. We get queen d7, rook to c3 played here, and now Dubov plays the move e5. Now when Magnus goes rook c3, his intention is quite simple. He wants to go for a double stack, maybe even a triple stack just to set it up. Say black plays, I don't know, rook c5, you get rook e3, rook c8. You can line up this triple stack here with the queen and the two rooks, and black is in all kinds of trouble. So Dubov plays e5, a very practical decision here. Magnus plays en peasant with pawn takes pawn, or en passant for everybody who's going to be angry at me for my pronunciation like a typical American. Magnus takes the pawn. Now, if not for en passant here, white would actually not be better in this position. But after takes, rook takes, we get rook to d3, rook d8, and now Magnus plays the move h4. Now, at this point, Magnus must be in heaven. He has a very nice positional advantage here. There's a weak pawn on d6. The double stack always forces black to guard the pawn with the queen and the rook. And now white just tries to improve the position while black simply has to sit and wait, keeping the rook and the queen very close to this pawn. We get h5, Magnus plays g3, we get queen f6, and now we have the move king g2. Dubov plays queen e5, we get a4 here, and now we have the move queen e4. Now what's amazing about this position is you'll notice computer really does not like black's position here. It thinks this is about 0.8, maybe even a little bit better here. Very hard to play simply because you're stuck guarding this pawn. And for Magnus, his idea in the long run is simple. What he wants to do in the long run is eventually he wants to get a position like this where he can play c5 and take advantage of the pin on the file, win the pawn and the game. Now, of course, this exact position, black is okay with perfect play, but the point still stands that black is stuck having to defend while Magnus slowly builds up the position. So we get queen to e4. King h2, queen f5, and now we get to move king g1. Of course, Magnus does not take the pawn because after takes, black would draw the game. So we get king g1. Rook e8 is played here, and now Magnus goes queen c3. We get queen to e5. Important to note that if Magnus were to grab the pawn here as well, after queen b1, king g2, queen takes b3 is fine, but maybe even rook to e1 and rook g1, I thought maybe it would be dangerous. Clearly, the computer doesn't agree with me, but there are multiple options. So after rook e8, we get queen c3, queen e5 played, and now Magnus trades the queens. Now you might be thinking, what is going on? Magnus has traded the queens. Now after pawn takes pawn, there's no longer a weakness on the d file, but Magnus correctly assesses this position as being much better for him due to the fact that his rook is on the only open file here. And one thing I've said in many of my videos is that when you have a rook and pawn endgame, or even about towers in general, if you control an open file, towers belong on the open file. So Magnus goes rook d7. We get the move a5 being played here, and now Magnus plays rook d6, and we get rook b8. If rook e6 were to be played, trying to stop white from winning the pawn, after takes, king f1, king f6, king to e2, e4, you can play the move king to d2 here, king e5, king c3, king d6, and now after b4, eventually white will win this king and pawn endgame. So we get the move rook b8. Now Magnus plays king g2 here. Nice move as well. The black rook is stuck guarding the pawn. Rook stops black from bringing the king forward, and so Dubov plays king f8. Magnus goes rook d5, attacking the pawn, and now Dubov goes rook e8. Now the computer actually prefers king f3 very slightly. I'm not exactly sure why versus rook d5, but Magnus still has a pretty clear-cut concept, which is that after rook e8, king f3, rook to e6, we now get to move rook b5, f5, and here we have c5 being played. Now you will notice that black rook is very active on e6 versus b8 and d6 before, but Magnus is assuming he's going to be able to create an endgame here where he can get 2 pawns on the queen side and win the game. Now what's also interesting here is that the computer thinks that f6 is the best move. This is a move that I think is very unusual. It's not the move that I would necessarily consider here, simply because you probably feel like white can play king to e4 and then something like c5 again, or maybe even f4 in this position, and you feel like you're in a lot of trouble. On top of that, there are 2 other issues. The big issue is that you're playing Magnus Carlsen, but the other problem is that you can look at the time situation here. Dubov is very low on time. Magnus has nearly 10 minutes more after this move f5 is played, or f5 I should say, in this position, and with so much time, Magnus can now use the time advantage and try to look for the absolute optimal moves. So we get c5. Dubov takes, and now we get the move rook takes a5. Magnus chooses to correctly capture the outside juicer because you always want to have an outside pawn running up the board. So in this position, after rook takes a5, Dubov plays rook c6, and now we get the move king e3 being played. Now here you'll notice that the computer actually thinks that black is probably okay if you play the move e4, but frankly, with so little time left on the clock here for Dubov, under 1 minute at this point in the game, it's really difficult to be critical of his moves because it's just not easy to play. Instead, he goes king f7. Now we get to move rook b5 here, king e6 played. Worth noting, the computer says after g5, if you were to take king g6 and f4, for example, after takes and h4, black now has sufficient counterplay to draw the game by pushing p on the h file. Dubov goes king e6. If he has more time, maybe he finds g5, but down to 15 seconds, we get king e6. a5. Now we have king d6 being played. Worth noting that king to d5 would not be possible here because after b4 there's a pin in play, and after king c4 white can now trade everything off here, and after king to d3, king b5, you can play f3, takes, king c4, say king b6, king d5, e4, takes. Black tries to run the king closer, but at the end of the day you end up losing here, as after takes and king g5, white pushes the h pawn up the board, gets a queen, and wins. So after a5, we get king d6, Magnus plays king d3, Dubov plays f4, and now we get takes, and we have the move king c4. Dubov goes g5 here, desperation to try and create the outside pass pawn, but it is way too late. Magnus takes, we get h4, now we have rook to b8, king e5 is played, and here Magnus goes rook h8, trying to win this h pawn once and for all, and with the outside a pawn, he will win in a few moves. So we get king f5, takes, rook to h3, king g4, rook c3, f3, king b5, rook f6, and now Magnus plays the move a6, and here Daniil Dubov resigns the game because Magnus is simply going to escort this pawn up the board alongside his king, or even just start winning the pawns. Something like this is also good enough where you're just going to keep pushing the p on the queen side. Really, black has no hopes whatsoever simply because you have this pawn on f2. So in this position, after a6 here, Daniil Dubov resigns the game. Magnus Carlsen gets a 6th win in a row. He is on a complete monstrous run here. 6th win in a row. He guarantees that he's going to win the tournament, but we'll now take a look at the 9th and final game of the event, where he's playing against Norbek Abdusattorov with the black pieces. So Magnus has clinched a guaranteed first place, but surely he's not satisfied. He wants to dominate. He always wants to win. That is the hallmark of a great champion, and Magnus wants to try and finish in style with 7 wins. Norbek, however, a very strong Uzbeki player. He's around the top 5 in the world currently. He is a former world rapid champion, so he is not someone to take lightly. Game starts with c4. Magnus plays e6, we get knight c3, and now we have the move bishop b4. Now this move is completely reasonable. Normally black will play d5 or knight f6, but I also think at this point Magnus, having clinched first with nothing to lose, wants to be more creative and more experimental to try and create imbalances and finish in style. So we get the move e4. Magnus plays c5, and now we have this move queen g4 being played. c5 is definitely a little bit dubious. Computer likes knight b5 as well as queen g4, trying to go for knight d6 right away, but this is the move that's played in the game. Magnus goes g6, and now we get the move a3 played here. Computer thinks after knight to b5, white is actually much better, better by about 1 pawn here, but we get a3 instead. Magnus trades, we get takes, knight c6, and now we have the move d3 being played. Now Magnus has made a lot of compromises here. He has created a weakness on the king side here. These dark squares are weak. There's no bishop to fianchetto here, so you have weaknesses. White also has the bishop pair, but what Magnus knows in this position is that it's going to be very difficult for white to play because the bishops are not super active. If I could magically take this pawn on c3 and put it somewhere else, you could put the bishop on b2 and play on the diagonal, but the pawn is in the way. Additionally, the light square B also doesn't have great scope. You have a lot of pawns in the way, so it's hard to activate the bishops. And in a rapid or blitz game as well, black's move should be quite a bit easier as white has to come up with the plans. So we get d6. Now here Norbek plays move queen g3, we get queen e7, and now we have this move f4 being played. Now this move is, in my opinion, a little bit of a mistake here. It's not a horrible move, but what you'll notice after f4, f5 is played is that suddenly both of these bishops are hemmed in. The dark square B has no scope. Even the bishop can't do anything on this diagonal. Even if you can somehow get the bishop to a3, the pawns blunt the force on this diagonal. Bishop on b2 does nothing. You have a pawn in a way. If you have the bishop on d2, still does nothing. So you can't really activate this way. And even if you get the bishop on e3, a position like this, still the bishop has no scope whatsoever. So that's why I think f4 is a bit of a mistake, because here, let's just say you play something like bishop d2 and f5 is played. Now you can maybe play bishop g5 using this diagonal, whereas after f4 and f5, now both these bishops are really clogged in by these pawns in the center. So we get the move e5 here from Norbek. Magnus plays knight h6, developing the knight, trying to castle the king, but also intending to go to g4 or f7 and put pressure on this pawn on e5. Norbek plays knight f3, we get knight f7, bishop to e2, and now Magnus plays the move b6. Here Norbek castles, we get the move bishop b7, and here d4 is played. Now all these moves are very difficult. One thing that I would say is that for Magnus, he's really found his groove, where this is another position where his moves are easier. Norbek's starting to get a little bit lower on time. Generally, if you're playing a position like this and you're playing from the white side, you probably know you're better here, but it's also very tricky because you know you can't use too much time, so you have to make certain decisions a little bit quicker, and Norbek starts picking up the speed when he plays move d4. Magnus goes knight a5, we get to move bishop to e3, trying to put pressure on the center once again while finishing the development, where you can bring a rook to the d file. Magnus plays rook c8, Norbek plays rook a d1, and now we get to move castles. Now there are many situations here where Magnus can consider taking and trying to win a pawn, but these positions become very hard to play because now the dark square B is becoming super active. Even a position like this where maybe black would be kind of okay if not for bishop b6, it's hard to play because the bishops are getting active, whereas Magnus definitely wants to try and keep the bishops in jail here. So we get the move castles instead. Norbek plays knight to h4, and now Magnus goes king to h8. Here Norbek plays d5, and this is a move that I really love here. Norbek spends 4.5 minutes, but he has to know that with the time getting low, he needs to create something explosive in the position, something dynamic where he can move a little bit quicker, but Magnus will have to use time. Now after d5 is played, you've got this massive big white center here. Something is going to open up, and you just assume that the bishops will become active. So Magnus plays rook g8. We get knight to f3 back, trying to guard the pawn on e5. We get bishop a6 here. Magnus trying to win the pawn on c4. And now we get knight to g5. Here Magnus plays pawn takes pawn, Noterbeck takes, and now we get a mistake with this move bishop takes c4, pawn takes pawn, queen d7, and we get takes, and bishop, not bishop c1, sorry, rook fd1 first, rook g7, and now we have bishop c1. Now what exactly has gone wrong for Magnus? In this position after rook takes d5, he has nearly 10 minutes, or actually has more than 10 minutes advantage on the clock, but it's a very dynamic position. It's very hard to find the absolute best moves, and the big mistake that he makes in this line is that after rook fd1 here, he's obviously supposed to play the typical computer human move, king g7. Computer move is what I mean, of course, and he just brings the king into the center of the board because dark square b is still not active and you can't bring it to the center of the board. But Magnus plays rook g7 like a human. We got bishop c1, and now we have rook e8, queen d3, and at this point Noterbeck is significantly better for one main reason, or two reasons I should say. First one, you have a passed pawn with a triple stack behind it, so black is having to worry about this pawn all the time. Secondarily, black is going to have to deal with this dark square bishop becoming active. So for example, if you move the knight, white goes c4, opening up the long diagonal, and black is in all kinds of trouble. So Magnus takes, we get takes, knight to e4, now we have queen to d3 here, and we get this desperation move c4 from Magnus. Apparently the computer thinks after queen 6 c4 and rook d7, black is only a little bit worse, but frankly from a human standpoint, allowing this bishop on the long diagonal where there potentially are double A batteries, just not realistic, and after g4, white is actually still much better. So Magnus goes c4. We get takes, rook c8, and now we have the move queen d4 being played, and here Magnus plays the move b5. You're probably thinking, well, why not take with the knight? You fork the rooks and you should win the game. Additionally, you also have this fork in play where you fork the king and the queen as well, so it looks like you're winning material, right? Well, not so fast, because after knight to c3, white can play this move rook to e1 here, and when you actually not rook to e1, sorry, rook to e5, what am I saying, rook to e5 here, and after black takes the rook on d1, now you have rook to e7 here. Winning the rook or the queen in this position is of course a classic 90-degree right triangle as well. What I realized as soon as I said it is that after rook to e1, knight takes d5, there is no rook e7 because I simply play knight takes rook. So after queen d4, Magnus goes b5 here. I suspect that Magnus may or may not have missed this tactic with rook to e5. At any rate, he's still trying to keep the game going with b5, stopping white from playing c4 and opening up the diagonal. So here Noterbeck goes bishop b2, Magnus plays rook c4, we get queen to e5, and now we have a6 being played to guard the pawn on b5. Noterbeck plays rook d4, Magnus plays h6, we get the trade, and now we have this beautiful move bishop c1 being played where Noterbeck wants to bring the bishop to the center of the board. Remember, for much of the game there was a pawn on c5 stopping the bishop from getting to d4, but now there is no longer this pawn here, so because there's no pawn, if you get the bishop to d4 and you get a wooden shield, you should probably win the game. Magnus goes king h7. We got bishop to e3, rook g8, and now we have the move h3. Noterbeck surely would have loved to have played bishop d4 here, creating the double A battery, but now there's rook to e8, and suddenly your queen on e5 is trapped here. It's actually not that bad because you can sack the queen, but that is beside the point as you are no longer winning. So Noterbeck plays h3, Magnus goes rook e8, and now we get the shocker of the day where Noterbeck Abdussatorov, a former world rapid chess champion, does a Botez gambit. He sacks a queen for a rook in a completely unnecessary situation. Now this move, in my opinion, is simply the fact that Noterbeck must have been a little bit nervous, thought he was winning on the spot, or miscalculated something very obvious. My gut instinct is that when he took on e8 here, he thought that after takes d7, queen d8, he had bishop b6, winning the game, but if you take the bishop, it is simply a check on the king, and after king moves, you go queen d8 and you win the game. So after rook e8, Noterbeck should have played the move queen d4, and here after rook e6 takes, let's just say black plays knight takes d6, queen d3, with this very active dark square bishop coming to the center of the board, you should win this game basically every single time. But Noterbeck instead takes, goes d7, queen d8, and now he plays the move bishop d4. A little bit lucky here that he's actually not losing in this position, because I'm pretty confident that he thought he had bishop b6 to win the game. And this is where we once again see the classic Magnus effect, where his opponents panic or they do something in a situation where they have a great chance to win the game. So we get bishop d4 here from Noterbeck, and now Magnus plays the move queen to h4, and the game rather abruptly ends in a draw. Now you're probably thinking, well, why did the game end in a draw here? The reason the game ends in a draw is that the white king is a little bit too vulnerable here if you make the queen, which is pretty much the only move to try and play on. After check, king h2, check. If white goes king g1, you simply do the yo-yo, and after king to h1, there's check, bishop g1, knight g3, and now you do the yo-yo with the horse, and we get a repetition either way. So after queen to h4, the game ends in a draw, rather abruptly, I should say. For Noterbeck, he makes this huge blunder with queen takes rook on e8, which was totally unnecessary. If he had played queen to d4, he would have won the game, and he would have actually guaranteed clear second place. So it's quite costly for Noterbeck, this blunder, because with this draw, Magnus does, of course, win the tournament by 2 points ahead of Wesley So, but Noterbeck does not get second place. He actually finishes in third place with this final round draw. So making the draw and not winning this game does cost him a little bit of money. At any rate, for Magnus Carlsen, the 5-time world champion, he continues to show excellent form, dominates this rapid portion of the Tata Steel Chess India event. Really no doubt about it after day 2 as to who is going to win, but he does showcase just how strong he is and why he is considered to be the best player of all time. But more importantly, why I think as we move towards the future, Magnus has spoken a lot about rapid and blitz. The fact that he's maintaining his level in these formats, it does mean that we probably have quite a bit longer of him dominating and playing in these events, which is always a good thing, because he has said that it sounds as though he's going to be dialing back his classical chess in the near future. So to see him playing this well in rapid and blitz, hopefully we have many more years to enjoy of this quality of chess. All right, so on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from day number 3 of the Tata Steel Chess India Rapid and Blitz event being held in Kolkata. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with some more great recaps after Magnus and company play in the Blitz portion starting tomorrow. Hope you guys enjoy the video and have a great rest of your day. See you soon. Bye.